Hello, my dear students. This is the last lecture on the end-of-life bioethics course, beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for all your many blessings in the midst of the trials and difficulties of life, Lord, and especially as we are immersed in this coronavirus pandemic. We ask your blessing, your guidance, and your love for each one of us. Protect us, guide us, so that we may search the appropriate cures and try to help all those who have been infected or affected by this epidemic, Lord. We love you, we adore you, and we ask that you continue to be with us, especially on this last lecture on the end of human life issues, to know that you walk with us every step of the way. We ask this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so what I have today is just three basic principles that I want to cover and applied to end-of-life issues, some of the issues that we've seen, particularly with the vegetative state and also with physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So the three principles that I'm going to be talking about today is the sources of morality, the principle of double effect, and cooperation with evil. All right, before we get into each one of these three topics, I'm going to do a little review and introduction to the three topics of today. And the introduction slash review is picking up where we had left off last semester with the course on fundamental principles in bioethics, in Catholic bioethics, as we were doing a phylogenetics, in other words, the origin of the human species as a whole. And we had looked on one side at the scientific data, evidence for evolution, including the evolution of the human family. And on the other hand, combining that or complementing it with the belief, our belief that we are created by God uniquely, individually, and that we are God's image, individually and collectively as humans. So picking up on that, I just want to reiterate the fact that we are created in God's image. Of course, this fact is a fact of belief, right? It's not a fact of science. It's not an empirical fact in the sense that we can measure it as we measure the physical reality around us. No, it is truly a metaphysical reality, if you will, that goes beyond the physics of measurement. But we can measure it, if you will, in other ways, by our conscience, by our soul, by our spirit, by our beliefs, by our faith, okay? And the Judeo-Christian belief is that we are created in God's image. So going back to that first chapter of Genesis, let me magnify this a little bit. What I have here is that quote at the end of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, verse 26, 26a, if you will. It's the first half of 26. And using that Bible interlinear, Hebrew interlinear program, Bible Hub, that I used last semester. This is chapter 1, as you can see, verse 26. And just a reminder, Hebrew, as a number of the ancient languages, are written from right to left. Okay, so on the screen here, beginning with a verse. This is the original Hebrew writing, and then the translation, the Hebrew translation into syllabic here above, and then below in brown or gold is the English translation of that. And so the verse says, "And said God, let us, man in our image, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the livestock. The verse continues, but I'm only looking at this A part of the verse, okay? Let us make man in our image and likeness. This imago Dei, this image and likeness, which is unique to the human species. And so we can ask the question, in what sense are we God's image? In what sense are we imago Dei? Not, again, physically, because God does not have a body like ours. We have a body that is made up of parts, namely organ systems that are made up of organs and tissues and cells, all the way down to the molecular level, atomic and subatomic level, etc. But we are basically made up of parts, physically, physiologically. Whereas God, one of the attributes of God is that it's simple and pure, so has no parts as such, all right? And therefore, we're not physically like God. Then it has to be spiritually. Specifically, two characteristics, two gifts that God has given us, the gift of intellect and the gift of will, all right, which we find again unique among all of creation, at least the creation that we've discovered so far here on planet Earth. We see that we are unique in this two characteristics of intellect and will, in contrast with other animals that essentially live by instinct. I had already given some examples of this in last course. If you recall, even the most primitive cultures, human cultures, all right, of the genus Homo, show some signs of intellect and will, for example, in paintings, and in artifacts and so forth, to the point that even the closest relative to us, genetically speaking, which is troglodytes, the chimpanzee, with a 99% homology with our genome, has no paintings, and the most elaborate artifact that it has used to our observations is a little twig to pull out ants or termites from a hole, okay? But certainly not tool making. Tool use is one thing, but tool making is a different category of skills, if you will. So we attribute that to the intellect and the will. And two aspects. Intellect is the capacity to know things that we know, all the way up to the level of abstract thoughts. As for example, when I say triangle, all right, I'm only saying a word, but that word has meaning and has a specific meaning in each one of our minds. There are many different shapes of triangles, but all triangles will have three sides and three angles, okay? And it is a thought, it is an abstraction that is being transmitted by the intellect. And the will, of course, the desire to transmit that, or the desire to receive that transmission, if you will, okay? So the will is always oriented in the human toward the good, or even when the good is an apparent good, which can actually be objectively an evil, but seems like a good to us. And so the will of the human is always oriented toward the good, whether the real good or the apparent good, because it comes from God. All right, so now having this little introduction background of our two unique capacities as humans, of the intellect and the will, then we can go into analyzing these three basic principles: the analysis of the moral act, or the sources of the moral act or the ethical act, and then cooperation with evil, and then also the principle of double effect. So moving forward here, the sources of morality or ethical behavior, because ultimately bioethics has to do with ethical behavior as applied to life, right? To human life and to the life that surrounds us on the environment, which is the course that we'll see next semester in a few weeks. There are three sources of morality or ethics, okay? If you think about them a little bit, the moral act, the object, the moral object itself, the intentions and the circumstances in which we exhibit that behavior, the moral behavior. Okay, so let's look at each one of these three one by one to understand then these sources of morality or ethics in our lives. The moral object is essentially the whatness, the answer to the question what is being done, okay? Now, the what is not just physical, physiological, but it's a moral, it's an ethical what, all right? So for example, if there is a killing, as in euthanasia, all right? The what is killing a patient. That is the what. So it has a moral quality. That is the moral object itself, right? The intention is another aspect of the person doing the killing, typically in the aspect of euthanasia, according to, as we are in the course of end-of-life issues. The agent is the doctor or the physician or the medical professional who is doing the killing on the patient, all right? But the what is the actual killing of the patient. And so you see, it's a moral object. It's not just a physical, physiological aspect, but has a moral character, we say, or moral quality to it, ethical quality. Okay. So people ask me, well, what are moral objects? What are some examples of moral objects? And according to principled ethics or principled bioethics, some objects are intrinsically evil, are always wrong, all right? And so what would be a list of intrinsic evils? A good list of intrinsic evils is the Ten Commandments, for example. Okay, so for example, killing, lying, cheating, adultery, all of these disorders objectively are wrong, evil, should always be avoided, regardless of the intentions of the agent, of the person acting, of the person who is involved in these actions. So for a succinct list, if you will, of actions that are intrinsically evil, the Ten Commandments is a good list, and that is straight up our Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, so let's move to the intentions. The intention answers the question of why. Why is the agent doing this? All right. So, for example, staying with euthanasia, the intention of the doctor is to kill the patient. Of course, the intention, you can say that the intention may be a good intention because the intention could be to avoid suffering of the patient. The patient is suffering or the patient is in pain, the patient is terminal, all right? And so the doctor is trying to avoid the pain or the suffering of his or her patient. All right, so the intentions reside always on the subject. So the intentions are subjective. Whereas the moral object, by definition, is objective, is regardless of the good intentions. That's why we can maintain precisely an objective morality. Some actions are intrinsically evil, regardless of the best intentions that they may harbor, all right? So even the best intentions cannot turn an intrinsically evil act into good, okay? But the intentions could be that the person is in a erroneous conscience, in a misinformed conscience. even what is known in an extreme case in an invincibly erroneous conscience. In other words, this person, there is such a malformation of their conscience over years, right, that the person practically, for all practical purposes, is incapable of seeing an intrinsically evil act as evil, right? The person is so deceived that that person is incapable practically of seeing that evil action as evil precisely. So that is an invincibly erroneous conscience, we say. All right, so a person with that conscience subjectively may lessen the culpability, the subjective culpability that that person may have. But the action itself still remains objectively evil, objectively wrong, immoral, or unethical, as in the example of euthanasia. All right. So again, staying with the topic of the course of end-of-life issues, a doctor, a physician, or a nurse, or a pharmacist, which are the three links in the chain, if you will, of distributing the medication, the lethal dosage, if you will. Either the prescription of the dosage by the doctor, or the dispensing of the dosage by the pharmacist, or the administration of the dosage by the nurse, right? It could be that all their life they grew up in such an environment that they don't share, like, for example, the Judeo-Christian value that we have, that each life is sacred in the eyes of God, and that each life is precious, and that life, human life, is a fundamental value, and that all people have an intrinsic right to life, right? It could be that these people did not grow up with that time of formation, that rather in their particular society where they grew up, especially when they absorbed their ethical values, some people were valued more than others, either because of their health, because of their intellect, or because of their wealth, okay, or because of their age, etc. So if that person grew up in that environment all their life, they basically absorb those values tacitly, passively, and they may see a patient who may be elderly and frail and in a terminal condition as of less value, because they're no longer productive, they're no longer healthy, they can no longer communicate, etc. All right, so the intentions are subjective. They reside in the agent, the person acting, and they answer to the question, why? Why am I doing this? All right. The third, of course, is the circumstances surrounding the action itself, the moral action, and the circumstances answer to the other questions of the where, when, how, okay? All the circumstances that are involved in the act of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Okay? Again, the circumstances can mitigate a culpability of the agent, of the person acting, all right? But the circumstances cannot turn an intrinsically evil act into good, all right? What the most that circumstances can do is to mitigate the subjective culpability of a person involved in some intrinsic evil. And it could be either because of ignorance, or it could be either because of duress or distress, or under pressure, even the threat of violence to the agent, and so forth. So, whereas the circumstances can mitigate then the subjective culpability of a person involved in an intrinsically evil act, the circumstances cannot turn an intrinsically evil act into a good act, because precisely of the first source, which is the moral object itself, right? So euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide as such, as a moral object, objectively remain intrinsically evil, whereas the people involved in it may have greater or lesser culpability depending a lot on their own conscience formation or malformation. Okay, moving forward then. Next, we're going to cover cooperation with evil. So let me diminish a bit the slide here. Excuse me for a moment. I'm going to pause the recording for a moment. Okay, continuing then with the next bioethical principle here, which is cooperation with evil. And in cooperation with evil, we have either formal or material cooperation. And then material cooperation may be further divided into immediate material cooperation or mediate material cooperation. And then finally, mediate material cooperation may be further subdivided into proximate mediate material cooperation or remote mediate material cooperation. Okay, so let's move forward now, and you'll see how the three sources of the moral act then apply as we look at cooperation with evil and the limits of legitimate or ethical cooperation with evil. All right. This one will have to do both intellect and the will, but the will is very much engaged in the cooperation with evil and the limits of cooperation with evil. So, formal cooperation. First of all, we have to understand that cooperation with evil, when we are cooperating with evil, the understanding is that we're not the principal agent. We're not the person actually doing the evil, right? The unethical act or the immoral act, but we are participating. We're somehow participating in that evil act somehow, even though we're not the principal, the main agent who is involved in the unethical or immoral action. Okay, so, and we can think of examples both in euthanasia and in physician-assisted suicide of people who are involved in the milieu of those actions taking place. So we're not the principal agent, but we're associated with them. To what level can we be associated with these acts? Up to what point? Okay. All right. So formal cooperation means that our will is engaged, that my will desires the same desire that the principal agent desires, which is the evil action itself. Okay, so formal cooperation means that my will desires the same, is engaged with the will of the principal agent, willing the evil. For example, let's take the case of Dr. Kevorkian, of which we spoke in our class. His desire was to exercise euthanasia on this population of patients that he had. All right, now he had determined, perhaps even in dialogue and consultation with the patient, fine, that these patients did not want to live anymore. All right, and we have seen from the study of the case that even of the 130 some patients estimated that he euthanized in his lifetime, not all, in fact, most of them were not terminally ill. Some had some level of illness, some were more mentally than physically ill, all right? Some were hypochondriacs, some were just were depressed, etc. But for whatever reason, you know, Dr. Kevorkian took it upon himself to facilitate or to actually kill these patients, all right, to euthanize them. So that's the principal agent. A person who cooperates with Dr. Kevorkian, hypothetically, in those killings, all right, if the person is cooperating formally, means that that assistant to Dr. Kevorkian is willing the same thing that Dr. Kevorkian is willing, which is the death of his patients. All right? All right, so that's formal cooperation, and formal cooperation is never allowed. Formal cooperation with evil is never allowed because the will engages, desires the same evil action, the same moral object as the principal agent. And so that can never be justified morally or ethically to cooperate formally with an agent involved in evil doing or wrongdoing, like the case of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. How about material cooperation? For material cooperation, we have to say perhaps, maybe, sometimes. So let's look at material cooperation. So material cooperation means that we do not desire what the principal agent desires. In other words, let's say that I'm an assistant. We are assistants to Dr. Kevorkian. We do not desire to kill those patients as Dr. Kevorkian desires, okay? But we are employed by Dr. Kevorkian. We are his PA or assistant, right? And so what are the limits? How can may I still participate in those killings even if I don't desire them? How can what is the limit of cooperation that I could possibly do? Okay, so material cooperation we saw is subdivided into two types, either immediate material cooperation or mediate material cooperation. And the distance here, right, the distance is a distance of quality, is not a quantitative distance of geographical distance, right? Whether I'm close next to Dr. Kevorkian and the patients or in another room or in another town. No, it's not a physical distance, it's a qualitative distance. It's a distance of a character, okay? And so immediate material cooperation is the cooperation that is necessary for Dr. Kevorkian to exercise the killing. Whereas mediate material cooperation is secondary, axillary to the actual act of killing. So I'll give you two examples here. So for immediate and for mediate, as we go forward, first, immediate material cooperation. Let's say that we are in the room with Dr. Kevorkian, all right? And Dr. Kevorkian is going to do a lethal injection, all right? So to hand him the lethal dosage, to hand him the injection, the syringe, okay, loaded, is immediate material cooperation, because without that syringe, Dr. Kevorkian cannot physically euthanize this patient. And so handing Dr. Kevorkian the needle, the syringe loaded with the lethal dosage would be immediate material cooperation. And therefore, even if I don't really will the death of the patient, I'm saying to myself, to my conscience, no, I'm just giving him the syringe. He's actually plunging it, all right? I'm not. But that is immediate. In other words, it's necessary for Dr. Kevorkian to have that syringe in hand in order to euthanize the patient. And so therefore, this immediate material cooperation, even though somehow I don't desire the death of the patient, is immoral, unethical, and may never be justified. How about mediate then? Mediate material cooperation may or may not be justified. Again, we have to look one level further in, okay? And so, as I pointed out, mediate material cooperation can be further subdivided into either proximate or remote mediate material cooperation. So, let's look at these further then. Again, proximate or remote does not have to do with the physical distance necessarily, all right, but actually a qualitative distance in this sense. So for proximate mediate material cooperation, it is, again, an action that is necessary in order to the immediate material cooperation to take place, okay? So this proximate immediate material cooperation is again necessary, essential for the immediate material cooperation to take place. All right? So for example, the amount of lethal dosage in the syringe, okay? The amount of lethal dosage, and we see how the intellect is engaged here. And the will, even though the will is limited, the will is not willing the death of the patient, but the will is engaged in putting the proper amount of the lethal dosage inside the syringe, well, potassium chloride, whatever it's going to be, okay? But that has to be a particular amount. If it's below that amount, it may not kill the patient. So it has to be a minimal amount. So loading, let's say, the syringe. Before I hand it over to Dr. Kovorian, loading the syringe, you see, is one step removed from the immediate handing over of the syringe. So loading that syringe could be considered proximate, immediate material cooperation. And that, of course, is unethical, is immoral, because it is necessary for the immediate material cooperation to take place. Okay? But there is, on the other hand, a remote immediate material cooperation that may be justified. That may be justified as long as the will is not engaged. So the will is not engaged, therefore it's not formal cooperation. Okay? And it's not proximal material cooperation. It is remote. And so remote could be, for example, the technician that is controlling the temperature inside the room, the hospital room where, or the clinic or wherever the euthanasia is going to take place, okay? Or the person who comes to adjust the air conditioning level. Because it's cooperation in this sense. If the room is either extremely hot or extremely cold, then Dr. Kovorian may step out and not perform the euthanasia. So controlling the temperature to a particular range, to some kind of range in that room to make it comfortable enough for people to be there, not for Dr. Kovorian specifically, but for any human being to be inside that room, to make that room comfortable, is a part of material cooperation of the act that is going to occur there, right? But it is immediate because it is not essential to the euthanasia of the patient. The euthanasia of the patient could have been done under extremely hot temperature or extremely cold temperature. And it's also remote because it's not involved in the actual action of the dosage itself. All right, it's not involved in the dosage, the passing on of the dosage, if you will. It's totally secondary and distinct from the chain, if you will, of poison, all right, into the patient's body. So these are examples where we can see that cooperation with evil is either formal or material. Go back to the full slide. Formal cooperation with evil is never allowed because it is willing the evil onto someone else. Material cooperation, it depends if it's immediate or mediate. Immediate, no, because it's a material action that is necessary for the evil to take place. But mediate, all right, again, we have to say it depends, making distinctions. It's either proximate or remote. Proximate, no, because even though it's an act that is secondary to the actual evil, that proximate, that proximity, that qualitative proximity to the material act itself, to the immediate act, taints, if you will, the cooperation into making it illicit, immoral, unethical. However, if the material cooperation is immediate and remote, in other words, totally dissociated, if you will, is another action that is occurring in that room that is totally dissociated from the evil action that is actually occurring in the room, then it may be permitted, it may be allowed. Finally, with regards to cooperation, there's one element that has to be always considered. We go down to that slide here, yes, which is the issue of scandal. And scandal, the issue here with scandal is that even an action that it is unrelated to the evil action itself, it may have the perception of being an evil action, and therefore has to be avoided in order to avoid scandal, precisely. Okay, so for example, give you a different example now at the institutional level of hospitals, a Catholic hospital that is merging with a non-Catholic hospital, all right, and that other non-Catholic hospital has a reputation precisely of performing abortions, euthanasia, etc., and perhaps that hospital kind of specializes in that. All right. Then, but the association is not really a merger. Merger was not the right word. I would say an association, a collaboration between a Catholic hospital and a non-Catholic hospital, which are the two hospitals in this one town. All right. Maybe the collaboration is to buy medical equipment together in bulk so that they would save money on the shipping and so forth, to coordinate the shipping, for example, of medical equipment. I don't know, something like that. That has nothing to do with the actual actions that go on inside the hospital. But the non-Catholic hospital has a reputation in the community for doing abortions, for doing euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, for doing contraceptive sterilizations, okay? All these actions that are unethical from the Catholic perspective. The perception may be among the community that the Catholic hospital is associating with the wrongdoing in this other non-Catholic hospital. So for the sake of preventing scandal, then that Catholic hospital should try to not associate, not collaborate with a non-Catholic hospital, or if it has to, let's say by way of survival, if it has come to the point where the Catholic hospital, the only way that the standalone Catholic hospital is going to survive in this town is to join forces, let's say at procurement of shipping and so forth of materials, of the medical equipment needed, supplies, with a non-Catholic hospital, then that Catholic hospital would have to do a campaign, literally an information campaign beforehand, before the association, the collaboration, to explain to the people in town, at least to the Catholic people, what are the limits of that collaboration, that they're not participating in the wrongdoing of the other hospital and so forth, and it's strictly for the purpose of bringing down the cost of shipping and so on and so forth. You understand, it would have to be literally an informational campaign to let the people know, the people at large know, and so as to eliminate the possibility of causing scandal because of a misperception, right? Misperception that a Catholic hospital is associating with another hospital who is involved, that is involved in immoral activity. Okay, let's take a little break here, and I'm gonna pause for a moment, and I'll be back soon. Let us now look at the third principle that I want to discuss today, which is the principle of double effect. Principle of double effect, which is used quite a bit, actually, in bioethics, in Catholic bioethics. It's a very handy principle, if you will, very practical, but it has to be understood properly, okay, and applied with prudence, because it's not the only principle, obviously, in bioethics, in Catholic bioethics, but it's one of the most useful ones, if you will, and you'll see what I mean. So there are four conditions for a double effect, and or 5. The fifth one I put in parentheses because the fifth one actually should be like the first one, which is this procedure which has some harm is the last resort. In other words, when does double effect apply? Double effect apply when we have two effects simultaneously from a single action. All right, from a single ethical, moral action, there are two effects. That's why it's called double effect, because one effect is a positive or good effect, and the other one is a negative effect, and they flow simultaneously from the same procedure. For example, a surgery, right? We can see a surgery is with the intention of healing a patient. But the surgery literally, physically involves opening up somebody with a scalpel, okay, and having that person bleed and so forth. So there's simultaneously a harm and a healing that are flowing from the same action. How do we justify the harm? Okay, these 4 conditions need to be met in order for the principle of double effect to be applicable to that surgery, for example. Okay, and so the act itself must be morally good or neutral. Secondly, the evil effect must not be directly will. See, again, the will is engaged here. And then third, the good effect must not flow directly from the evil effect, rather simultaneous, but not the good from the evil directly. We'll get to each one of these. Finally, proportionality. There should be proportionality between the two effects, okay? So let's look at each one of these briefly, one by one. And again, sticking with the general topic of the course, end of life, we can look at, for example, with regards to cancer, terminal cancer, and treatment like chemotherapy or even surgery, resectioning, for example, the case of Brittany Maynard, resection of the brain when there was a diagnosis of brain cancer, okay? So first, the act itself must be morally good or neutral. So the act, I'm talking about the moral object, that is the act. What is being done? Well, brain surgery is being done, or chemotherapy is being done, okay? That is the act itself is morally good or neutral. In the case of Terry Schiavo, for example, the act, the peg, all right, the peg was in itself either good or neutral. In other words, the peg itself was not causing harm to Terry. It was causing good because it was feeding her, or minimally it was morally neutral. All right. So the act itself must be good or neutral. This is a reference to the 3 sources of the moral act, precisely the object. The moral object must be either a good object or morally neutral, not an intrinsically evil object, because then it doesn't qualify for double effect anymore. Secondly, the will. The evil effect must not be directly willed. So again, we have a surgeon performing surgery, right? Or in the case of Brittany, the drastic case of Brittany Maynard with cancer of the brain, the surgeons that went in and resectioned a part of her brain, part of the lobes that were cancerous, did not have the desire to harm her, to cut out a part of her brain. They didn't will that evil, if you will. Okay, they didn't want to harm her, but it was necessary to try to contain the cancer, to see as a last resort, obviously, to see if that would stop the spread of the cancer. It was not known until it was done. Unfortunately, it did not work. The cancer continued to spread. It was too late. All right, so the evil effect must not be willed directly. It has to be tolerated because it's going to happen, but it's not desired, it's not willed. All right. Okay, third, the good effect must not flow directly from the evil effect. All right, this is very important, that the effect, that the both effects are occurring simultaneously, and simultaneously is not necessarily chronological. Again, there may be a chronology, in other words, physically, chronologically, the surgeon has to open up the patient first and then extract the tumor secondly. Okay, so there is a chronology there, that's a sequence, that is a physical chronology, and that's not the directness that we're talking about here. This directness is more qualitative, it's as far as the nature of the act itself. Okay, and so the good effect must not be a direct result of the evil effect. Mm-hmm. And in the example of Brittany, for example, let's say, how was the resectioning of the brain justified? Precisely as double effect, which is a particular case of the more general case of chemotherapy for a cancer patient. How is the, uh, the negative effects of the therapy, of the cancer therapy, justified because of the prognosis, the expectation that the patient is going to heal with this intervention. So it has to be some hope of recovery by doing this procedure. Okay, and that's why it's so important that diagnosis, which is what is going to establish the hope of recovery, the prognosis. So again, the good effect must arise, let's say, simultaneously and not be a direct consequence of the evil effect itself. All right, then finally, proportionality. In other words, the damage, if you will, that is being done has to be in proportion to the good that is expected from that damage, if you will. In other words, the surgery that is being done has to be localized, contained for the region where the tumor is. Okay, so let's say that there is a spotted a cancer of the liver. So after there is a diagnosis, the doctors at some point have to go in to see if the patient agrees, okay, and try to section out the lobe of the liver that is cancerous, okay? Hopefully it has not spread through the whole liver, but they cannot tell that 100% without actually opening up the patient and going in. Well, so if it is sufficient to section out one lobe of the liver, okay, they're not going to take out the entire liver. They just take out what is necessary to achieve the expected positive result. And that is proportionality. That is proportionality, okay? That another example would be cancer, ovarian cancer. So if the cancer is only on one ovary, they're not going to take out both ovaries, okay? They can take out the cancerous ovary and not both. Because at that point, the intention may have been actually to sterilize the person. And the intention is not to sterilize the person. The intention is to take care of the cancer, right? So that's proportionality. And then finally, like I mentioned, it is the last resort, yes, because if there is a better way of treating, all right, if there's a non-invasive way of treating the patient, then that is desired, that's a standard protocol, all right? If there's no non-invasive way of treating the patient, then it has to go invasive. One example would be if the surgery can be done laparoscopically, it should be done that way. If there's no way to do the surgery laparoscopically, then it has to be traditional with scalpel in hand, all right? Okay, so this 1.5, that's why I put it in parentheses, because it's understood that when we go into double effect, then is the last resort, okay? Every other positive, every other treatment that only has a good effect has been exhausted. Okay, so just to wrap up then, well, what I have on the last slide is just a few references, okay? And these are 5 references specifically from the Catholic tradition, the official teaching of the Magisterium. First of all, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, part 3, which is the moral aspect of our teaching of our faith, is part 3 of the Catechism. You know, the Catechism has 4 parts, and this 3rd part is dedicated to the moral of the ethical teaching, including the analysis of the 10 Commandments, the moral act, and all these teachings you find there in the Catechism. Also, a couple of encyclicals of St. John Paul II, who dealt with the relationship between faith and reason, and precisely seeking arguments to enter into the secular environment and try to establish a dialogue with the secular community, whether it's the scientific community or the lawmakers or people at large, just secular humanism, to enter into dialogue. The splendor of truth, veritatis splendor, that truth cannot contradict itself. And Jesus Christ is a combination of truth, and his teachings are truly the truth about our human life, our human nature, okay? And so the splendor of truth in 93, and then fides et ratio, faith and reason, the dialogue between faith and reason, and how one illumines the other. And precisely this picks up on that, what I mentioned at the beginning on reason and will, or the intellect and the will, the 2 gifts that the Lord has given us, our humanity, that make us his image, the capacity that we have for reasoning and for searching and finding the truth, and finding it, searching it more, and then the capacity to communicate that truth intelligibly, all right? Fides et ratio, because our faith illuminates our reasoning, our intellect. And then from Pope Benedict, Caritatis in Veritate, Caritas in Veritate. Essentially, Pope Benedict wrote 3 encyclicals, or 2.5, if you will, because the 3rd one was written in collaboration with Pope Francis. Okay, he had it already planned, but he did not have time to publish it. He had a scheme, bosquejo, an outline. He had quite developed the encyclical, but then he resigned, and Pope Francis took over. So then Pope Francis decided to publish that one. But it's he admits at the very beginning that it was mostly developed by Pope Benedict. All right. So the truth in charity. The truth in charity. So Benedict wrote 3 encyclicals, like I said, on faith, hope, and charity. And he began precisely with Deus Caritas Est, the first one. God is charity, God is love. And then Spes Salvi, hope saves. And finally, Fides, Lumen, our faith illuminates our reasoning. But this one, Caritas in Veritate, is speaking charitably in truth, all right? Speaking or doing charity in truth. So these are documents that can help understand the teachings of the Church in these 3 basic principles of Catholic bioethics, and also, of course, the ERDs that you're very familiar by now, particularly in the area of cooperation, which is part 6 of the ERD. You know that the ERDs have 6 parts. This booklet that I've used in the course, and the 6th part, part 6, is dedicated precisely to cooperation, okay, and the limits of cooperation with evil. Now, this part, I must say, is at the institutional level. It's at the institutional level. So we have to translate that down to the level of the individual, okay? And so I can say also that at the level of the institution, the guidelines are more stringent, precisely because there's a greater possibility of scandal in the community at large. If an individual human being misbehaves or acts unethically or immorally, it may or may not scandalize some people around him or her, all right? But if a Catholic institution collaborates with evil, then the potential for scandal is much greater. And so the limits of cooperation are more stringent at the institutional level, and the ERDs are written for Catholic healthcare services, therefore for Catholic institutions, all right? So when you read that part 6, keep in mind that those are more stringent guidelines because they are at the institutional level. Okay, so that's it, what I have for today, and I'll be posting this soon so that you can work on your summaries. These 3 principles. First, the sources of morality, the moral object, the intentions and the circumstances surrounding those actions, then the principle of double effect, and the principle of cooperation with evil and its limits. Thank you once again, and many blessings to you. Please remain safe during this time. God bless you. Bye-bye.